The day Louise Yates rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she was already doomed in the eyes of every soul who watched her pass, and she knew it before her horse had even cleared the main street. She had learned long ago that a woman who knew things she was not supposed to know, who carried dried herbs in a leather satchel and spoke to her animals in full sentences, who healed fevers with poultices and set broken bones with steady hands, and refused to weep when men told her she ought to. That woman would always be doomed before she even opened her mouth. Louise was 26 years old, dark-haired and brown-eyed, with hands calloused from years of work on her late father's homestead up in Abilene. Her father had taught her botany and medicine from the books he kept in a wooden chest beneath his bed, old volumes worn soft at the spines, and she had absorbed everything he offered because she had nothing else to do in the long Kansas winters except read and watch the sky and tend to things that needed tending. Her mother had died when Louise was 9, taken by a fever that no one in Abilene had known how to break, and that single fact had driven Louise to learn everything her father's books contained about the human body and the plants that grew around it. When her father died in the autumn of 1878, he left her the homestead, but the homestead was mortgaged to a bank in Abilene, and the bank had no patience for a woman trying to work land alone. She sold what she could, packed what mattered, and pointed herself south toward Caldwell, where she had heard there was a need for someone with medical knowledge, since the nearest proper doctor was 40 miles east, and the townspeople were growing faster than their resources. Nobody in Caldwell had advertised for a healer precisely, but Louise had enough confidence in her own usefulness to believe she could make a place for herself. She had done it before, in smaller ways, in smaller places. She was wrong about Caldwell. Or rather, she had not anticipated the particular flavor of wrong that Caldwell would produce. The first person to call her a witch was a woman named Hester Grady, who ran the dry goods store on the east side of the main street with her husband Raymond. Louise had been in town only 4 days when a boy named Tommy Atchison came to her rented room above the feed store with a deep gash along his forearm where he had caught it on a wagon wheel brace. Louise cleaned the wound with a solution she made from willow bark and clean water boiled over her small stove, then packed it with a poultice of yarrow that she had dried and carried in her satchel, and bound it neatly with strips of clean linen. The boy's mother had watched the whole process from the doorway with wide eyes, and when Tommy's wound healed clean and without festering over the next week, she told her neighbors, and her neighbors told their neighbors, and within a fortnight Louise had treated 2 more injuries and 1 bad chest cold. It was the chest cold that undid her. Old Mr. Potts, who was somewhere north of 70 and had a rattle in his lungs that sounded like dried beans in a tin, came to her because his daughter brought him, half carrying him up the narrow stairs to her room. Louise made him a steam with eucalyptus oil she had purchased from the apothecary, and brewed him a strong tea of mullein and honey, and had him breathe the steam for 20 minutes while she rubbed a preparation of rendered lard and camphor into his chest. He fell asleep in her chair and woke 3 hours later breathing easier than he had in weeks. His daughter wept with relief. Hester Grady was at the dry goods store across the street and saw the old man descend the stairs to her shop, and she saw his color, and she heard him tell Raymond Grady that the woman upstairs had near-worked a miracle on his breathing. What Hester Grady did not hear was the rational explanation of steam and herbs and time. What Hester Grady saw was a dark-haired woman with strange jars and a leather satchel, and no husband and no church affiliation, performing cures on sick men who came to her alone. The word witch moved through Caldwell like a fire in dry grass. Louise heard it first from the young woman who ran the laundry, a girl named Dottie who was kind enough to warn her that Hester Grady had been speaking to Reverend Aldous about the matter. Reverend Aldous was a tall, thin man with opinions that arrived before he did into any room, and he had already preached one Sunday about the dangers of ungodly medicines and the women who practiced them. He had not named Louise specifically, but everyone in the pews had looked at one another and known. The trouble with being called a witch in 1879 in a small Kansas border town was not that anyone was going to burn you. It was subtler, and in many ways more damaging than that. It meant that the families who might have hired you as a seamstress said no. It meant the restaurant where you had been eating your suppers suddenly seemed always full when you arrived. It meant boys threw stones at your window in the dark of night and then ran laughing, and when you went to the sheriff, he looked at his boots and told you he could not prosecute what he did not see. It meant that your landlord, Mr. Fitch, knocked on your door one evening in early April and told you very apologetically that he had decided he needed the room for something else, and could you be out by the end of the week? Louise stood in the doorway of that small room with its single window and its smell of old wood, and looked at Mr. Fitch and felt a cold, quiet anger settle into the center of her chest. She had known anger before. She had learned to keep it in that particular place, contained and cool, because anger that escaped a woman in 1879 became evidence of all the things people already suspected about her. "I'll be out by Thursday," she said. She had until Thursday to figure out where she was going to go. It was not panic that drove her out of the room and down the stairs and onto the main street in the middle of a Tuesday morning, though it might have looked like it from the outside. It was the simple practical need to solve a problem before it became a disaster. She was walking with her head down and her satchel over her shoulder, working through her options, when she collided firmly with a broad chest and staggered backward. The man who caught her by the elbow to keep her from falling was tall and weathered, and wearing a canvas work coat that smelled of horses and open air. He was perhaps 30, maybe 31, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something unwilling, and eyes the color of good river water, a kind of shifting gray-green that changed depending on how the light hit it. He was not handsome in the way that men who knew they were handsome tended to be handsome. He was handsome in the way that a well-built barn is handsome, in a way that was entirely unself-conscious and functional. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said, steadying her. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "Neither was I," Louise said, pulling her elbow gently back. "No harm done." He looked at her with a kind of direct, uncomplicated attention that was different from the way most men in Caldwell had been looking at her lately. Most men in Caldwell looked at her sideways, or looked through her, or looked at her with the particular combination of wariness and curiosity that the word witch had generated. This man looked at her the way you look at someone you are genuinely trying to see. "You're the woman above Fitch's feed store," he said. It was not a question. "I was," Louise said. "Apparently I am being relocated." Something shifted in his expression. It was not pity which she would have resented. It was more like recognition, the look of someone who understood what being pushed out of a place felt like. "Samuel Townsend," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. His hand was large and very warm, and his grip was firm without being performative about it. "Louise Yates. I know who you are, Miss Yates. You fixed up Cal Henderson's boy last month. Kid would have lost that arm to infection if you hadn't caught it when you did. Cal told me." He paused. "He also told me what people around here have been saying about you, and I want you to know that I consider that a particular kind of stupidity that I have no patience for." Louise looked at him for a moment. In her experience, men who said things like that usually followed them with something that undermined the sentiment. She waited. He did not undermine it. He simply looked at her, steady and serious. "Where are you going on Thursday?" he asked. "I haven't determined that yet," Louise said honestly. Samuel Townsend tilted his head slightly, as though he were calculating something. "I run the Double T Ranch about 6 miles west of town. I've got a foreman and 8 cowboys, and no one on the property who knows anything about medicine beyond wrapping a cut in a dirty rag and hoping for the best. 2 weeks ago, one of my men nearly died from an infected tooth before we could get him to the doctor in Wellington. I've been thinking for some time that I need someone on the ranch who actually knows what they're doing when it comes to keeping people healthy." He paused again. "I'm offering you room and board and a fair wage, Miss Yates. The room is private and the work would suit your skills. You'd have your own space, and I'd ask nothing of you except that you tend to medical needs as they arise and keep yourself fed and comfortable. The offer comes with no conditions attached except that you be treated with the same respect I expect all my people to receive." Louise stared at him. She had not been expecting that. She was good at expecting things. It was one of the skills that had kept her functioning through a difficult life, but she had not expected that. "Why?" she asked. "I told you why. I need someone with your knowledge. You could hire a man with the same knowledge and have considerably fewer problems with your neighbors." "I could," Samuel said, "but you're the one who's available, and from what I've heard you're considerably more skilled than any man I'm likely to find on short notice. And frankly, Miss Yates, the way this town has been treating you offends me considerably, and I'm not inclined to participate in it by turning away when I could offer a practical solution." She looked at him for a long moment. The April wind came down the main street of Caldwell and moved his coat and moved her hair, and the morning smelled of horse and dust, and the green beginning things that lived underneath that smell in spring. "I accept," she said. She could not have said afterward exactly what made her say it so quickly, except that she trusted her instincts, and her instincts told her that this man's word meant something, and that this was not a situation in which she could afford to be cautious when a door was opening. She was on the Double T Ranch by Thursday afternoon with her 2 bags and her leather satchel and the wooden box of her father's medical books, which she carried in her arms like something precious, which it was. The Double T spread across a broad stretch of Kansas grassland that in April was just beginning to green at the edges, with a main house built of limestone and timber that had the look of something added onto gradually over time, practical and unadorned but solidly constructed. There were 2 barns, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a garden plot behind the main house that someone had attempted and then abandoned. Louise looked at the garden plot and made a mental note. Samuel showed her to a room off the back of the main house, separate from the family quarters but not isolated, connected by an interior hallway, and with its own exterior door that opened onto the backyard. It was a good-sized room with a window that looked east, a proper bed with a rope frame, a writing desk, a small wood stove, and a set of shelves that he had clearly just had installed, the wood still pale and smelling of sawdust. "I had those put in for your supplies," he said, nodding at the shelves. "Cal Henderson told me you work with a lot of dried plants and jars and such. I figured you'd need storage." Louise set her father's box of books on the desk and looked at the shelves. They were well made, even. The man had done that before she had agreed to come. He had assumed she would say yes, or perhaps he had simply built them in hope. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that encompassed considerably more than the shelves. "Dinner's at 6, he said. "I'll introduce you to the men tomorrow. They've been told to behave themselves, and they will, or they'll answer to me." He said it simply, without drama, in the tone of a man who did not need to make threats because his word had always been sufficient. He left her to settle in. The men were a mixed collection, as ranch hands in Kansas in 1879 tended to be. There were 4 cowboys who had come up with Samuel from Texas 3 years back when he had established the Double T, steady and loyal, and used to his ways. There were 2 brothers from Missouri named Pete and Danny Holt, who were younger and somewhat less polished but willing workers. There was an older man called Grover who had been on the ranch since before Samuel bought the land and who had simply stayed on because he did not particularly have anywhere else to be. And there was a young man named Eli who was 17 and worked as a stable hand, and was mostly remarkable for his complete inability to stay out of trouble of the minor domestic variety. Always breaking things, always wandering into spaces he shouldn't, always showing up where something unfortunate was happening, not through malice, but through an unerring instinct for coincidence that kept everyone mildly exhausted. Louise met them all the next morning in the yard, and they looked at her with varying degrees of curiosity, wariness, and attempted nonchalance. She looked back at each of them with the same direct, unapologetic attention she gave everyone, and she said clearly, "I understand you've been told why I'm here. I want to add to that. I will treat any complaint you bring to me with complete seriousness and complete discretion. Whatever you tell me about your health stays between us. If you are sick or injured, come to me early. Don't let things become problems that didn't have to be problems. That's all." She turned and went back inside to organize her shelves. Pete Holt said quietly to his brother, "I like her." Danny said, "Me too." Samuel, standing at the edge of the yard with his arms crossed, heard this and said nothing, but there was something happening in his expression that he would have been hard-pressed to name if anyone had asked him to. The first month at the Double T was the most peaceful Louise had experienced in years. She organized her herbs and supplies and her father's books. She tended to a series of small ailments: Grover's worsening knee, Danny Holt's infected tooth which she drew herself with pliers heated and cleaned in alcohol, several cuts and bruises, and one badly sprained ankle when Pete fell off the barn roof trying to fix a loose shingle. She replanted the abandoned garden with a practical eye toward medicinal herbs, using seeds she sent away for by mail, and she planted vegetables alongside them, because she had been raised to believe that a working garden should earn its keep in multiple directions. She also, gradually, began to eat dinner at the same table as Samuel Townsend. The first few weeks she had taken her meals in her room, which was her habit and her preference when she was somewhere unfamiliar. But Samuel, on the 6th day, knocked on her door and said that dinner was ready and he would appreciate the company if she was willing, and she found that she was willing in a way that surprised her slightly. He was not what she had expected upon closer observation. She had expected a man who was generous in broad gestures and inattentive in small ones. She had been wrong. He was attentive in small ones. He made sure the wood stove in her room was stocked when the nights turned cold. He mentioned to her without ceremony that the gray mare in the second barn was gentle if she wanted to ride. He left books on the kitchen table that he thought she might enjoy, and never said anything about having left them except that they were there. He properly read not just newspapers but novels and histories, and one afternoon she found him working through a volume on natural science with the same focused attention he gave to everything. "Do you enjoy it?" she asked, sitting across from him on the porch with her own book. He looked up. Natural science, reading, in general. He considered the question as though it deserved actual thought. "Yes. I grew up with a father who thought reading was something you did when you couldn't find useful work to do, so I did most of my reading quietly, like something shameful. It took me a while to stop feeling that way about it." Louise looked at him over the top of her book. "My father thought reading was the most useful work there was. He taught me everything I know from books." "What did he do, your father?" "He was a failed farmer who was a very successful reader," she said. "He knew more about botany and medicine and history than any man I've ever met. He just couldn't keep a crop alive to save his life." Samuel laughed. It was a genuine laugh, uncomplicated and warm, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up like a window being pushed back. Louise found herself wanting to make it happen again. It became a pattern, those evening conversations on the porch or at the dinner table. She discovered that Samuel had grown up in Central Texas, the son of a rancher who had worked him hard and loved him in the way that men of his generation loved their sons, which was to say practically, and without much demonstration. He had learned ranching from the ground up, had driven cattle up the Kishom Trail twice in his early 20s, had saved his wages and bought this land at 27 with the particular single-minded ambition that comes from having worked very hard for very long. He had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman in Texas who had decided she did not want a life this far from anything familiar. He spoke of this without bitterness, only with the kind of steady acknowledgement of what was past that she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him. "Do you miss Texas?" she asked one evening, "Sometimes I miss the feeling of it," he said, "but I don't miss what it was actually like. This land suits me better. The sky is bigger." She understood that. She looked up at the Kansas sky in the evening, which was enormous and shifting, and put everything happening beneath it into a kind of useful perspective. "Why haven't you married again?" she asked, and then immediately wondered if she had overstepped. He didn't seem bothered by it. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands. "I suppose the right person hasn't come along at the right time," he said, "and I've never been willing to marry someone I didn't genuinely want to spend every day with. That's probably a higher standard than most people set." Louise looked out at the darkening yard and said nothing, but something in her chest had shifted slightly, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that. What she did not know, and would not know for some time, was that Samuel had come home from that first evening dinner with a feeling in his sternum that he could not account for, a kind of warmth that was entirely inconvenient given the circumstances. He was her employer. She had come to his ranch under difficult conditions and trusted him to behave decently, and he intended to behave decently, and so he did what men of his particular character tend to do with inconvenient feelings. He set them carefully aside and kept working, but the feelings did not cooperate. What brought things to a head, as things in small Kansas towns in 1879 tended to be brought to heads, was an event in late May that Louise had not anticipated, and Samuel had not anticipated either. Hester Grady's youngest child, a boy of 4 years called William, came down with scarlet fever. Scarlet fever in 1879 was not a death sentence if you caught it early and treated it well, but it was a serious illness, and in a town the size of Caldwell with the nearest doctor 40 miles away, it could become very bad very quickly. Louise knew scarlet fever. She had treated it twice before, once in Abilene and once in a farming community north of there, and she knew the protocol: rest and cool cloths and liquids and carefully managed fever, willow bark tea to bring the temperature down, close monitoring of the throat for the membrane that could close breathing entirely. The problem was that the Gradys would not send for Louise Yates. She heard about it through Dottie, the laundry girl who had a cousin married to Raymond Grady's brother and who sent word out to the Double T because she knew Louise was there, and she was frightened for the boy. Louise rode into town herself, which she had not done since coming to the ranch, and knocked on the Grady's door. Hester Grady opened the door and looked at Louise with an expression that was a complicated mixture of terror for her child and hostility toward the woman standing on her porch, and she said, "We don't want your kind of help." "Your son has scarlet fever," Louise said, keeping her voice level. "I have treated it successfully before. The doctor in Wellington cannot reach you for 2 days at minimum. I can help him now." "You'll put a curse on him," Hester said, and her voice cracked on it, because even she did not entirely believe it, because she was a frightened mother and frightened mothers will believe anything that lets them not be responsible for what happens. "Mrs. Grady," Louise said, "I know you don't like me, and I know what you've said about me, and I'm not asking you to change your opinion. I'm asking you to let me help your son. Those are 2 separate things, and only one of them matters right now." There was a long silence on the porch of the Grady house. Then Raymond Grady appeared behind his wife, and he looked at Louise and he said, "Come in." Hester made a sound of protest and then made no more sounds, because Raymond Grady was not a bad man, only a man who loved his son, and he was not going to let pride or his wife's fear kill his boy. Louise worked through that afternoon and into the evening. She sent for cool water, and she managed the fever, and she checked the boy's throat every hour, and she brewed willow bark tea that she sweetened with honey so the child would take it, and she sat beside his bed through the long night keeping watch, while Raymond Grady slept in the chair in the corner and Hester sat on the other side of the bed watching Louise with eyes that were still hostile, but also, increasingly, something else. By morning the fever had broken. William Grady sat up in his small bed and asked for biscuits, which Louise considered a very promising sign. She packed her things and stood at the door to leave, and Raymond Grady shook her hand with both of his and could not speak for a moment. Hester Grady stood in the hallway and looked at Louise and said, in a voice that cost her something visible, "Thank you, Miss Yates." "Take care of him," Louise said. "Keep him rested and the fluids going for another week." She rode back to the Double T in the early morning, tired in the deep way of someone who has been awake for 20 hours on concentrated attention, and she found Samuel Townsend standing at the barn door when she rode in, clearly having been watching the road for some time. He helped her down from the mare without saying anything about whether she needed help or not, which was the correct instinct because she was tired enough to be grateful for it. She stood with her hand on the horse's neck for a moment, feeling the solid warmth of the animal as a steadying thing. "The boy will be all right," she said. "I heard you went in," Samuel said. "I heard Hester Grady wouldn't let you and you talked Raymond into it." "I did." "The whole town is going to know by noon that you sat up all night with that child." "I expect so." "Are you all right?" She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with that direct, serious attention that she had come to think of as particularly his, and there was in it something that went beyond concern for an employee, something that he was not making any effort to conceal, and she was too tired to pretend she didn't see it. "I'm tired," she said honestly. "Go sleep," he said. "I'll have someone look after your mare. Dinner will be waiting whenever you wake up, no matter what time it is." She went. She slept for 12 hours, dreamlessly, in the deep sleep of the genuinely exhausted. When she woke it was evening, and there was a covered plate on the writing desk in her room and a note beside it in Samuel's handwriting that said only, "Eat. The ranch is still standing. SD." She sat at the desk and ate cold roast beef and biscuits and read her father's copy of a manual of medical botany, and felt something in her that had been clenched for a very long time begin cautiously to unclench. The change in town came slowly, the way most true changes come, without announcement. Hester Grady told her neighbors about the night Louise had sat with William. Some of her neighbors were moved by this, and some of them were not, but enough were moved that the tenor of things shifted slightly. Reverend Aldous preached no more sermons about ungodly medicine, possibly because 3 of his parishioners had quietly informed him that ungodly medicine had just saved a child while his prayers had not, and he was a man with enough self-preservation instinct to understand when a position had become untenable. People began appearing at the Double T gate with ailments. Louise treated them all, charging fair prices to those who could pay and nothing to those who could not, which was her father's system, and the only one that made sense to her morally. Samuel watched this happen with a kind of quiet satisfaction, and he said to her one evening in June, leaning on the fence rail while the sun went down over the grassland in the particular long gold way it did in Kansas evenings, "You're becoming indispensable." "I was always indispensable," Louise said. "They just didn't know it yet." He laughed, that warm, uncomplicated laugh, and looked at her sideways in the evening light. There was something in his expression that had been building for weeks, something that sat just behind his steady gray-green eyes, and she could see it, and she thought he could see that she could see it, and neither of them had yet said anything about it, which was a kind of tension that had its own sweetness to it, even if it was also increasingly difficult to simply ignore. What finally broke the silence between them was not a dramatic event. It was a Wednesday evening in early July, hot and still, with fireflies beginning in the tall grass at the edge of the yard. They were on the porch, and Samuel had brought out 2 glasses of lemonade, which Grover had made in a fit of culinary ambition that morning, and they were sitting in the chairs they had come to think of as their chairs, and they had been talking about nothing consequential, about the state of the south pasture fence and whether to plant more alfalfa, and then they were not talking at all. Only sitting in the particular silence of 2 people who have become comfortable enough with each other that silence is no longer uncomfortable. Louise was watching the fireflies. "I want to say something to you," Samuel said. She looked at him. His hands were wrapped around his glass and he was looking at the yard, not at her, which she recognized as the posture of someone who was about to say something they were uncertain about. "Say it," she said. He turned and looked at her directly. "I am aware that you came here as an employee, and that I have been careful to keep that line clear. And I want you to know that I will continue to keep that line clear for as long as you want me to, and regardless of what I say next, because I would rather have you here on any terms than not have you here at all. And I don't want you to feel that your position is contingent on anything except your own choosing." Louise watched him. She was very still. "I have been in serious danger of falling in love with you since approximately the second week you were here," Samuel said. "Probably before that, if I'm being honest. I don't want to do anything about that you're not entirely willing for me to do, and I'm raising it now only because I am tired of not raising it, and because I think you've seen it anyway, and keeping the pretense up feels like a kind of dishonesty I'm not comfortable with." The fireflies moved in the tall grass. A mockingbird sang from somewhere in the darkness beyond the barn. "I have also been in serious danger of falling in love with you," Louise said, "since approximately that same time, possibly earlier, though I was better at hiding it." A silence. "Were you?" Samuel said. "Probably not as well as I thought," she admitted. He set his lemonade down on the porch rail and turned in his chair to face her properly. The porch lamp threw warm light across his face, and he looked at her with a nakedness of expression that she had not seen in him before, open and genuine, and slightly afraid in the way that people are afraid when they want something very much, and are not yet certain they will have it. "I would like, with your permission, to court you properly," he said. "Which in practical terms means very little different from what we've already been doing, except that I'd like to be honest about what it is." Louise looked at him for a long moment, taking stock of herself, doing the thing she had always done, which was to look clearly at what was real, and not at what she was afraid of, or what other people told her she should want. What was real was this man across from her on this porch in the Kansas summer, who had given her work and space and bookshelves and quiet respect, and who laughed in a way that opened his whole face, who treated her with the same seriousness he gave everything, who had never once suggested that her knowledge or her capability was anything other than exactly what it was. "Yes," she said, "with my permission." Something moved through him like relief, and something else that was quieter and more lasting. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to move away. And when she did not move away, he held it in his large, warm hand and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the fireflies kept moving in the grass. He did court her properly. In the weeks that followed, there was a quality to everything between them that had shifted, not dramatically, because neither of them were dramatic people, but unmistakably. He brought wildflowers back from rides across the ranch, simply, without ceremony. She brought him cups of coffee in the morning when he was working at the kitchen table over his accounts, and they would sometimes work in silence side by side, each at their own task, which was the particular intimacy of people who are genuinely at ease with each other. He asked her to teach him about the plants she used, and she did, walking the garden with him in the evenings, pointing out each one, and he listened with complete attention and remembered what she told him, which was the kind of thing that gets remembered. There were moments of greater declaration, too. One evening in August, he took her riding to the top of the rise that stood at the northwest corner of the property, and they sat their horses looking out over the grassland in the last of the day, and he said, "When I bought this land, I thought I was buying a ranch. I think I was buying the view." Louise looked out over that enormous Kansas sky, orange and rose and the first deep blue of coming evening, spread across the whole of the visible world in every direction, and felt something so complete and simple that she almost didn't have words for it. "It's extraordinary," she said. "Yes," he said, and he was looking at her. She turned and found him looking at her and did not look away. He leaned from his saddle and kissed her gently, briefly, the first time, with the horses standing patient and the enormous sky around them, and it was the kind of kiss that is less an ending of a thing than a beginning of one. The troubles, when they came from an unexpected direction. In September, a man named Conrad Hale rode into Caldwell from the south. He was a land buyer, the kind that had been circulating through Kansas in those years, looking for parcels that could be consolidated and sold on to railroad interests that were moving through the territory. Conrad Hale was smooth and well-dressed and pleasant in the superficial way of men who have learned that pleasantness costs nothing and buys considerable latitude. He had dealings in Wellington and in Wichita, and he came to Caldwell with papers and letters of credit, and a story about economic opportunity that he told to everyone who would listen at the hotel bar. He also came with a specific interest in the Double T. The Double T's land sat on ground that a railroad survey team had identified as desirable for a junction route. Samuel did not know this yet. Conrad Hale came to the ranch in the second week of September on the pretense of social call, and he was charming and agreeable, and he looked around the spread with the eyes of a man doing arithmetic, and he made a casual remark about having heard that Samuel might be open to offers. "Where did you hear that?" Samuel said. "Word travels," Hale said pleasantly. "Not from me it doesn't," Samuel said. "The Double T is not for sale." Hale smiled and said all the appropriate things about respecting a man's position and perhaps if circumstances changed and so forth, and he rode back to town, and Samuel watched him go with a particular stillness in his expression. That evening he told Louise about it. She was at the kitchen table sorting dried herbs into small labeled tins, and she listened to the whole account without interrupting, which was one of the things he had come to most appreciate about her. "She listened until you were finished." "He'll come back," she said. "Men like that always come back." "I know," Samuel said. "The question is how." She looked at him steadily. "If he's connected to the railroad, there are legal instruments he can use. The railroad's influence on land acquisition is considerable." "I know that, too." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to lose this land, Louise." She heard something in his voice when he said her name, something deliberate as though it meant more than the name itself. She looked at him and found him looking at her with that open, serious face. "I know you're not," she said. "Hale came back in October, and this time he came with different tactics. He went to Reverend Aldis and made a donation to the church, a substantial one, and then he had a conversation with the Reverend that involved the words moral character and the question of whether a respectable rancher ought to have a woman of Louise Yates' reputation living and working on his property unchaperoned. He said nothing explicit. He didn't need to. He planted the seed and let Caldwell's particular soil do the rest. Reverend Aldis came to the Double T on a Thursday morning and delivered a speech about propriety and reputation that was clearly rehearsed and that Samuel listened to with complete stillness from beginning to end. When Aldis had finished, Samuel said, "Reverend, I'll thank you to say your piece and then go." "Mr. Townsend," Aldis said, "the woman's reputation in this town is a matter of public record, and her living on your property without benefit of." "Her reputation in this town," Samuel said, "is the result of ignorance and small-mindedness, and at least one man's deliberate mischief, and it is no business of yours or anyone else's how I choose to run my household. Miss Yates is a skilled medical practitioner who has served this community with considerably more dedication and competence than it deserves given how it has treated her. I will ask you not to speak of her in that manner again." Aldis drew himself up. "The community has concerns. The community," Samuel said, "can take its concerns and direct them elsewhere. Good morning, Reverend." He held the door open. The Reverend went through it. Louise had heard this from the hallway. She stood with one hand on the doorframe, and something in her chest was very full and very still. She heard the Reverend's horse leave the yard, and then she heard Samuel's footsteps in the kitchen, and she came around the corner and he looked at her. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Perfectly," he said, but he was still angry, a contained and very cold anger, and his jaw was set. "Samuel," she said, "that man is going to cause more trouble. Hale put him up to this." "I know he did." "What are you going to do?" He looked at her. He reached out and pushed a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so natural and simple that she did not even register it as significant until a moment later, and then it was all she could think about. "I'm going to do what needs doing," he said. "And first I'm going to ride into town and have a conversation with Conrad Hale." "Be careful," she said. "I'm always careful," he said, which was true. He rode into Caldwell and he found Hale at the hotel, and he sat down across from him at a table in the dining room with 2 cups of coffee between them, and he said, in a voice that was entirely quiet and entirely serious, "I know what you're doing, and I want you to understand that it isn't going to work. The railroad wants that right-of way. You tell them to find another route. There's land enough in Kansas. And if you involve the Reverend in any more conversations about the people on my property, I will have you examined for the land fraud you committed in Sumner County 3 years ago, which I have heard about from reliable sources, and which I suspect left enough of a paper trail to be inconvenient." He had heard about the Sumner County matter from Pete Holt, whose cousin worked in the county recorder's office, and had mentioned it in passing. Samuel had spent 3 evenings quietly writing letters and receiving replies, and he had enough to make the threat credible. Hale sat with his coffee and his pleasant expression for a long moment. Then he said, "The railroad has other options." "Good," Samuel said. "Use them." He rode home in the late afternoon and told Louise what had happened, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table and listened, and then said, "And you think that will hold?" "For a while," Samuel said. "Men like Hale move on when a property becomes more trouble than it's worth. And if he doesn't, then we'll deal with what comes next," Samuel said. "Together." That word sat between them, together. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the late afternoon light came through the kitchen window and made everything inside it warm. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "I want to ask you to marry me," Samuel said. "I'm asking it now, before anything else happens, because I don't want to wait any longer, and I don't want you to think I'm asking it for any reason except that I love you and want to spend my life with you, in that order, and no other reason. The ranch and the trouble and all the rest of it is separate. This is only about you and me." Louise looked at him across the kitchen table, with the late light and the smell of coffee and dried herbs, and that particular quality of silence that she had come to think of as belonging to them, the silence of 2 people who are genuinely at rest with each other. "Yes," she said. He got up from his chair and came around the table and took her hands and pulled her to standing and held her. And she leaned into the solid warmth of him with the particular relief of something found after being lost. And he pressed his mouth to her hair and held on. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed to be said. They set the wedding date for the first Saturday of November, which gave them 6 weeks, and Louise thought 6 weeks was entirely sufficient time to organize a wedding, given that she was not interested in anything elaborate, only in the essential fact of the thing. Samuel agreed. He was not a man who cared about ceremony for its own sake, only for what it meant. What happened in the 5 days before the wedding was not what anyone expected. Tommy Atchison, the boy whose arm Louise had treated in her first week in Caldwell, came riding out to the ranch in a considerable state of alarm on a Tuesday morning, with the news that his father's barn had caught fire in the night and 2 of the Double T's horses, which were boarded there for the season while Samuel's south barn was being re-roofed, were in it. Samuel rode immediately to the Atchison property and found the barn already destroyed, a heap of smoking timber, and the 2 horses gone. Not dead in the fire, gone. Someone had taken them before the fire was lit. He stood looking at the wreckage with a cold clarity, and he understood. This was Hale, or someone Hale had hired. Horses stolen to create a loss and a fire to cover the tracks. It was clumsy and it was escalating, and it told him that Hale had not moved on as he had hoped. He did not escalate in return. He went to the sheriff, a man named Garrett who was steady if cautious, and he laid out the whole of it: Hale, the railroad interest, the Reverend, the horse theft, the fire, clearly, and with everything he could document. He brought the letters from his correspondence about the Sumner County matter. He brought the name of his lawyer in Wichita, who had already been briefed. Sheriff Garrett listened and then said, "I can hold Hale for questioning." "Do it," Samuel said. Hale was in the Caldwell jail for 36 hours and released for insufficient direct evidence of the horse theft, but the holding itself was sufficient. A man in Conrad Hale's line of work operated on reputation and on the belief that he was untouchable, and 36 hours in a county jail in Caldwell, Kansas, was a significant crack in that belief. He left town the following week. The 2 stolen horses were found tied in a ravine 3 miles south of town by Danny Holt, who had been riding that ground systematically, and were returned to the Double T without ceremony. Louise heard all of this on the Wednesday before the wedding. She sat at the kitchen table with Samuel and he told her all of it, and she listened and then said, "Is it over?" "I think so," Samuel said. "Men like Hale are opportunists. When an opportunity stops being easy, they find another one. And if another one comes along later, then we'll handle it later," he said. "Together." There was that word again, sitting between them like something settled. The wedding was on the first Saturday of November 1879, in the main room of the Double T Ranch house, which was the biggest room available and was large enough to hold the ranch hands and a selection of Caldwell residents who had, over the months, found reasons to reconsider their opinions of Louise Yates. Reverend Aldous was not asked to perform the ceremony. The justice of the peace from Wellington came up and did it, a quiet man named Marcus Hood, who had known Samuel from his first year in Kansas and who shook Louise's hand when he arrived and said, "I've heard a great deal about you, Miss Yates. All of it to your credit." She wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks of the engagement, a deep blue wool that was practical enough to be worn again and fine enough for the occasion. She wore her hair pinned up with her mother's tortoiseshell combs, the one piece of jewelry she had retained from her parents' house. Samuel wore his best coat and had his boots resoled in Caldwell and looked like what he was, which was a man who was very happy. The ranch hands stood in a line. Grover had made an enormous effort with his hair. Pete and Danny Holt were in clean shirts. Eli, the stable hand, had somehow turned himself sideways in the 3rd row and spent the ceremony attempting to turn back without attracting attention, which attracted considerable attention. Louise stood across from Samuel in front of Marcus Hood and looked at him and felt completely certain, which was the feeling she had been waiting for, and had not known she was waiting for until it arrived. They said the words and Samuel put a plain gold band on her finger, which he had ridden all the way to Wichita to get, because Caldwell's jeweler did not have anything that seemed right. She put a band on his finger that she had ordered by mail and which had arrived 2 days before the ceremony, and he looked at it on his hand with an expression of such straightforward satisfaction that she had to look away for a moment because the feeling in her chest was almost too much. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Marcus Hood said. Samuel looked at her. She looked at him. He kissed her, proper and tender, and with his hands cupped around her face, and the room made the sounds that rooms full of people who care about you make, and Grover actually cheered, which was so unexpected from Grover that everyone laughed. Afterward, when the food had been eaten and the table cleared and the ranch hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the last of the visitors had ridden back to Caldwell, Louise and Samuel sat on the porch in the November cold with blankets around their shoulders and the dark sky above them enormous and thick with stars. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, testing it. "That's not my name," she said, and then understood he was asking something else, and she looked at him. He was smiling slightly. "I told Raymond Grady last week when I saw him in town that after November 1st anyone who wanted to speak of you would call you Mrs. Townsend, and they'd do it with respect." He laughed and said he'd pass that along. She considered this. "You didn't mention Calloway before. I was using an expression," he said. "The point was the Mrs. Townsend and the watching their mouth part." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "You're going to be insufferable now, aren't you?" "Almost certainly," he said. She laughed genuinely, a full laugh that she had not allowed herself very often in her life, and he looked at her with that open, unguarded expression and reached over and took her hand under the blanket. The stars were very bright. The Kansas wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of the yard with a sound like breathing. "Samuel," she said. "Yes." "I'm very glad you walked into me on the main street in April." "I'm very glad I was walking the wrong direction," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat in the winter dark together, and it was good, and it was real, and it was theirs. The months that followed had the quality that good things have when you are actually living inside them, dense with small events, full of the texture of daily life, surprisingly ordinary in the best possible way. Louise had not expected that happiness could feel so much like ordinary work, but she found that it could, that the ordinary work of a shared life was its own particular richness. She continued her medical practice, which grew steadily. By the spring of 1880, she had a regular stream of patients coming to the Double T from Caldwell and from the surrounding farms and ranches, and she had begun discussing with Samuel the possibility of a proper medical room, a dedicated space with better equipment. He commissioned a small addition to the east side of the house, and it was built in the early summer, a clean, bright room with good shelves and a proper examination table that she ordered from a supplier in Kansas City. The town's attitude had shifted enough to be remarkable. Hester Grady stopped by the ranch in March with a jar of preserved peaches and an apology that was approximately 50% actual apology and 50% justification, which Louise accepted in its entirety because she understood that people apologize as well as they are capable of, and not always as well as they ought to. And Hester's apology was the best she had in her. Louise offered her tea and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about William's continued good health, and it was not comfortable but it was honest, and Louise thought honesty was a reasonable foundation for anything. Reverend Aldous remained cold and distant, which she did not particularly mind. Some fences were not worth the effort. In April of 1880, she told Samuel that she was expecting their first child. She told him at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in the plain direct way she had of saying things, and he sat very still for a moment, and then got up from his chair and came around the table and pulled her to standing and held her with a completeness that said everything he was not quite able to say out loud. "Are you all right?" he finally managed. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, which is an advantage." He laughed into her hair. She felt it more than heard it. "A baby," he said. "In November, if my calculations are correct," she said. Which they usually are. The pregnancy was, in medical terms, uncomplicated. Louise had the benefit of her own knowledge, which helped considerably. She continued to work through the summer, refusing with characteristic directness all suggestions that she ought to be resting more, though she did accept Samuel's persistent campaign to get her to eat more, which she had always been inclined to forget to do when she was concentrating on work. He was careful with her without being suffocating, which was the particular skill of a man who understood the difference between care and control. He made sure she had everything she needed. He rode to Wellington himself to get the medical supplies she requested. He read, in his systematic way, every book she had on obstetric medicine, which was not extensive but was better than nothing, and he asked her questions about what he read, and she answered them, and somewhere in that shared reading they both came to feel more prepared. She felt him watching her sometimes, not intrusively but with a quality of attention that was simply love, straightforward and complete, and she would look up from whatever she was doing and find those gray-green eyes on her, and feel something so steady and warm that it was almost like standing in sun. Their son was born on a Thursday morning in mid-November, 1880, in the room off the back of the house that had been Louise's room when she first arrived, which had become a general room since she moved into Samuel's quarters after the wedding. She had set it up for the birth well in advance, and she managed a large portion of the process herself because she knew what was happening and could guide the capable woman from Caldwell named Mrs. Park, who had delivered enough babies to be steady and competent, through anything she needed. Samuel was not in the room, but he was on the other side of the wall, and she could hear him not pacing in the way that men who are deliberately standing still do not pace, and she found this deeply endearing. The baby arrived healthy and loud, and with his eyes wide open, looking at the world with the particular unblinking attention of someone who has just arrived somewhere very new and intends to take detailed inventory. Samuel was brought in, and he stood over the small, wrapped bundle and looked at his son with an expression that Louise would remember for the rest of her life. That open face, completely unguarded, showing everything he felt without any attempt to manage it. "Look at him," Samuel said. "I have been looking at him," Louise said, tired and luminous and certain. "I can see he's going to be exactly like you." "God help us all," Samuel said, and his voice was rough with feeling. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Samuel looked at her. "What do you want to call him?" She had been thinking about this. "James," she said, "for my father." Samuel reached out and touched his son's face with one careful finger. "James Townsend," he said. "Hello, James." The baby looked at him with those wide open eyes. "He knows you," Louise said. "He's going to know me very well," Samuel said. They named him James Walter Townsend, Walter for Samuel's father, whom Samuel had complicated feelings about but had loved in the way you love difficult people who shaped you, and James for Louise's father, who had given her everything that mattered. James Townsend was, from the beginning, exactly like his father, methodical, observant, calm in a way that was somehow completely at odds with being an infant, and yet entirely characteristic. He watched everything with those gray-green eyes, and he slept when he was tired and ate when he was hungry, and did not make unreasonable demands, which Louise pointed out was either an excellent omen or would eventually balance out with a second child who was considerably more dramatic. The double T grew. Samuel bought the adjacent parcel to the north in the spring of 1881, which added considerable grazing land and meant hiring 2 more men. Grover, who had been on the ranch longer than anyone else, was given the official title of head of operations of the North Pasture, which he received with the maximum amount of gruffness and the minimum amount of acknowledgement that he was pleased. But everyone could tell he was pleased. Eli, the stable hand, had grown into a solid young man of 19 who had stopped knocking things over quite as frequently, and had turned out to have a genuine gift with horses, which Samuel recognized and put to use. Louise's medical room had become, by 1881, something that the county was beginning to discuss officially. A physician from Wellington named Dr. Hawes came out to meet her in the spring and spent an afternoon going through her supplies and records and asking her questions in the manner of someone who expects to be impressed and is trying not to show that he is being impressed. He shook her hand when he left and said, "I'll be making a recommendation to the county board about formally recognizing what you've established here." "I'd appreciate that," Louise said. Dr. Hawes paused at his horse. "I understand you've been doing this work for several years now, Mrs. Townsend." "Since I was 20, she said. "My father taught me." "Your father did an exceptional job," the doctor said, and rode away. Samuel had heard this from the kitchen window and came out onto the porch as the doctor disappeared down the road, and he leaned against the door and said, "So, he's recommending formal recognition," Louise said. "Of course he is," Samuel said. "Was there any doubt?" "There is always doubt," she said. "It's good to have it resolved." He came and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him in the evening light. And below them on the grass James was making his way across the yard with the determined lurching quality of a 14-month-old, who is absolutely certain of his direction and only somewhat certain of his balance. "He's going to fall," Samuel said. "He falls all the time," Louise said. "He gets up all the time, too." They watched their son navigate the yard with his focused determination, and the evening was warm and the ranch was quiet and the land stretched out around them in every direction under the enormous Kansas sky. Hale had not returned. The railroad had found a different route south of Caldwell, which Samuel had heard about through channels, and the Double T's land was left alone. The threat had resolved itself in the way Samuel had predicted. When the easy opportunity was no longer easy, the opportunist moved on. Reverend Aldous retired in early 1882, and his replacement was a younger man named Reverend Cole, who arrived in Caldwell with a practical and relatively open mind, and who called on Louise in her medical room in his first month in town, and said he wanted to understand what she did and how he could refer people appropriately. She appreciated this considerably. The second winter at the Double T as a family was deep and cold in the way Kansas winters are, the kind that settles in with genuine commitment and makes the spring feel like a resurrection when it finally comes. They spent the evenings by the fire, Samuel with his books and his accounts and Louise with her father's medical texts, and the new volumes she had been adding to her collection, and James between them, working through the toys that Samuel carved with a patience that surprised Louise given how little of it he wasted on other things. She discovered that Samuel was very good at carving. He had a jackknife that he had carried since he was 12 and a steady hand, and a quality of focused patience when he worked, and the things he made were simple and good. He made James a horse and a dog, and a collection of small figures that James moved around the floor in complex narratives that he narrated to himself in the half-intelligible language of toddlers. Louise watched this one evening and felt the particular full weight of her own life. She had not expected this life. She had not been the kind of woman who constructed elaborate fantasies about her own future because she had been too busy surviving it to dream in detail. And yet here was this life, whole and real and considerably richer than anything she had planned, with this man beside her and this child on the floor between them and this house around them that had become hers as completely as anything she had ever owned. She told Samuel she was expecting again in the spring of 1882. He received this news with the same stillness and then the same complete embrace, and this time he said, "Are you feeling all right?" "Better than last time in the early months," she said honestly. "I know what to do now." "You knew what to do last time too," he said. "I know more now," she said. "Knowledge compounds." He pulled back and looked at her. "You're remarkable, you know." "I'm practical," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. Their daughter was born in October of 1882 in the same back room with Mrs. Park again, and the same quality of Samuel being very deliberately still on the other side of the wall. She was a small, fierce baby with dark hair like Louise's and eyes that were indeterminate at first and settled over the following weeks into something very close to Samuel's gray-green, a combination that seemed like the world was making a point. They named her Clara Louise Townsend. James, aged nearly 2, regarded his sister with the solemn attention of someone conducting a thorough assessment. After several minutes of this scrutiny, he appeared to make a decision and patted her blanket with one small hand, which Louise and Samuel agreed was as clear a declaration of approval as they were going to get from him. Clara was, as Louise had predicted, considerably more dramatic than James. She announced her requirements loudly and had opinions from an early age that she expressed with a directness that Louise recognized as coming directly from her own side of the family. Samuel called her the most opinionated 7 pounds he had ever encountered, and Louise said that if she inherited nothing else from her mother, she hoped it would be the willingness to say clearly what she thought and the sense to back it up with evidence. The Double T in 1882 was a different proposition from the Double T of 1879. The land was better managed and more productive, the cattle operation was solid, and the medical practice that Louise ran from the East Room had become an established institution in the county, recognized by Wellington's medical board and operating with a small but real budget from county health funds. She had trained Mrs. Park in more detailed medical techniques, turning her into a capable assistant, and she had begun corresponding with a physician in Chicago who was doing interesting work on infection and sanitation, and who was, refreshingly, willing to correspond with a woman without qualification. The question of the town's opinion of Louise Yates, or rather, of Louise Townsend, had been resolved by the simple and irrefutable evidence of her work. She had delivered a dozen babies, pulled more teeth than she could count, set bones, treated fevers and infections, saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to the 40-mile distance between Caldwell and Wellington. People can hold opinions against evidence for a very long time, but in a small frontier community where bodies need tending, and there is only one person willing and able to tend them, those opinions eventually yield to practical reality. Hester Grady and Louise Townsend were not friends, exactly. But they were neighbors in the broader sense, and when Hester's second boy came down with a respiratory infection in the winter of 1881, she sent for Louise without hesitation and without apparent awareness of any irony in this, which Louise considered a form of progress. There was one afternoon in the summer of 1882, before Clara was born, that Louise thought of often in the years that followed, as the kind of afternoon that captures something essential about a time in a life. Samuel had come in from the north pasture in the midday heat, dusty and warm, and found her in the garden pulling weeds from around the chamomile, with James sitting in the dirt beside her, supposedly helping but mostly redistributing the dirt to new locations. Samuel had crouched at the edge of the garden and watched them for a moment, and then he said, "James, are you helping your mother or making her job harder?" James said something emphatic and largely incomprehensible that communicated clearly his position that he was helping. "He's helping," Louise confirmed, not looking up from the chamomile. Samuel sat in the garden dirt in his work clothes and began pulling weeds too. He was not particularly good at it and pulled several things that were not weeds, and Louise made corrections with the matter-of-fact patience she brought to most things, and James instructed them both in his private language with considerable authority, and the summer heat pressed down on the garden, and the chamomile smelled warm and sweet, and the mockingbird was back in the elm at the edge of the yard. "I want to tell you something," Samuel said. "Tell me," she said. "I was riding the north pasture this morning," he said, "and I was thinking about the day I ran into you on the main street in Caldwell. I was walking the wrong direction because I had gone to the telegraph office to send a wire to my lawyer about a land matter, and I came out in a hurry and turned left instead of right, and you were there." Louise looked up at him. "I know," she said. "You told me." "What I didn't tell you," Samuel said, "was that I had been on the verge of selling this property." The Hale situation hadn't happened yet, but there had been another offer the month before from a different buyer, a fair offer, and I had been seriously considering it. I was tired that year. Running the ranch alone was harder than I had anticipated, and the profit margins were tight, and I thought maybe it wasn't the right venture for me. Louise was very still in the garden. "I sent a wire to my lawyer that morning to discuss the offer," Samuel said. "And I walked out of the telegraph office and turned left instead of right, and I ran into you." She looked at him. He was looking at her with complete simplicity, no drama in it, just the direct offering of a thing he had been carrying and had decided to give her. "If you had turned right," she said, "I would have gone back to the ranch and eventually accepted the offer and moved on," he said, "and I wouldn't have met you." The chamomile smell was warm and the mockingbird sang, and James put a fistful of garden dirt very carefully into Louise's lap, which was his way of sharing. "Samuel," she said. "Yes." "I'm glad you were walking the wrong direction." "So am I," he said, "every day." James said something authoritative into the silence and then turned his attention back to the important work of the dirt, and Louise and Samuel looked at each other over their son's head, in the garden in the summer heat, in the life they had made. By 1883, the Double T was home to a settled and complex world. James was nearly 3 and had developed a deep and devoted interest in horses, which Eli encouraged with the patience of someone who understood that passion was the foundation of skill and skill was worth cultivating wherever you found it. Clara at 8 months was presiding over the household with the cheerful tyranny of babies everywhere. Grover had bad days with his knee but refused to be slowed down, and Samuel had quietly arranged that Grover's work was never too physically demanding without making a point of it that would have injured Grover's dignity. Pete and Danny Holt were both talking about homesteading their own parcels, which Samuel supported with the straightforward generosity of a man who understood that people who had given you good work deserved good futures. He gave them both a portion of cattle from the Double T herd as a starting point, and they rode out to their new land with the cattle and their provisions, and the particular light of men who are beginning something. 2 new hands came to take their places. A quiet man named Abraham who had come up from Texas, and who was the finest horseman Louise had ever seen, and a man named George Fitch, no relation to the Fitch who had evicted Louise in 1879, as George was at pains to establish, who was an excellent carpenter and had the habit of fixing things that needed fixing without being asked. Louise looked at her household and her medical room and her garden and her children and her husband, and the ranch spreading out in all directions under that vast Kansas sky, and she felt the completeness of it without sentimentality, just with clear and grateful recognition. One evening in the autumn of 1883, when the light was going gold and Clara was in her cradle in the corner of the sitting room and James was asleep against Samuel's side on the settee with a picture book open on his lap, Samuel looked at Louise across the room and said quietly, so as not to wake anyone, "Are you happy?" Louise set down her book. She looked at him, this man who had married her and believed her and defended her and built her a medical room and made space for all of her in every sense she could measure. She looked at the room around them, at the books on the shelves and the lamp burning and the child asleep and the cradle moving slightly. "Yes," she said, "completely." He looked at her with that unguarded face, and in it was everything he felt, which was considerable, and he said, "Good." Then James stirred and made the sound that preceded waking up confused, and Samuel shifted to accommodate him, and Clara made a small sound from the cradle, and Louise got up to see to her, and the evening moved forward into night in the ordinary, extraordinary way that the best evenings do. The seasons moved forward. Kansas lived around them with its enormous weather and its vast grassland and its particular quality of light that Louise had stopped being surprised by and had begun to simply love. The ranch grew. The medical practice grew. Their family existed in the middle of all of it with the density of something genuinely alive. In the spring of 1885, James Townsend, aged 4.5 and already possessed of strong opinions about horses that Eli was quietly feeding, rode his first horse unassisted in the Double T yard. It was the gray mare, Louise's mare, who was old enough and patient enough to bear a small, determined person on her back without making a production of it. James sat up there with Samuel walking beside him, and looked over the gray mare's ears at the yard and the barn and the grassland beyond with an expression of complete authority, as though he had been expecting this view from exactly this altitude for some time, and was now gratified to have arrived. Louise watched from the fence with Clara on her hip, and felt the kind of feeling that has no name, the particular feeling of watching your child become slightly more themselves. "He's a natural," Eli said from beside her. "Of course he is," Louise said. "He's been watching you work for 2 years. He's been watching his father," Eli said. "He walks like him already, same sort of stillness." Louise looked at her son on the old gray mare and her husband walking beside him with one hand near but not touching, ready if needed and not interfering otherwise, and she thought that Eli was right. James had Samuel's stillness, that quality of attention that was complete without being heavy. "He'll be a good man," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Eli said, without any doubt at all. Clara, balanced on her mother's hip, grabbed a fistful of Louise's hair and announced her presence with the particular forcefulness that was entirely her own. She was 2.5 and had words, many words, deployed with the confidence of someone who considered language a weapon she had been born knowing how to use. She looked at her father and brother on the horse and said, "Me too," with absolute conviction. "In a year or two," Louise told her. "Now," Clara said. "Not now," Louise said. "Now," Clara said more emphatically. Samuel heard this from across the yard and looked over, and his expression was the combination of amusement and complete love that Clara specifically produced in him, slightly helpless and entirely devoted. "Next spring," he called. "Clara's turn next spring." Clara considered this negotiation and accepted it with the provisional patience of someone who was not going to forget. The evening of that same day, the children asleep and the ranch quiet and the spring dark soft and mild, Louise and Samuel sat on the porch again. They were always on this porch. It was their place, the physical location of their ongoing conversation, and the chairs had shaped themselves to them over the years in the way that chairs do when they belong to particular people in a particular way. "I was thinking," Louise said, "about the first time we sat out here." "The first time I asked to court you properly," he said. "Before that," she said. "The first week, when I was still eating dinner in my room half the time and you left books on the kitchen table." He looked at her. "You noticed that?" "I noticed everything," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark yard with the stars above it. "I kept leaving books and telling myself it was simply a gesture of hospitality." "Was it?" "No," he said. "It was absolutely not." She smiled. He saw her smile in the faint light from the interior lamp, and he smiled back, and they sat in the easy quiet that was their particular kind of companionship. "Louise," he said. "Yes. I want you to know that what we have is the thing I'm most proud of. Not the ranch. Not anything else I've built or done. This." She turned and looked at him. He was serious in the way he was always serious, without performance. "I know," she said. "I know you feel that." "Good," he said. "I want to make sure you always know it." She reached across and took his hand under the stars, the same gesture, the same holding on, all the years of it running through it. His hand was warm and familiar and entirely hers. In later years, when their children were grown, and the double T had passed through a generation of good use into something that belonged to the landscape as surely as the limestone hills or the river or the long grass, people in Caldwell would tell the story differently depending on who was telling it. Some told it as the story of the witch woman who came to town and turned out to be a healer. Some told it as the story of the rancher who recognized a good thing when he saw it. Some told it as the story of how medicine came to their part of Kansas, which was true in a practical sense if not the whole truth. The people who had actually been there, Dottie the laundry girl, now a grown woman with her own household, Tommy Atchison, who had the arm that Louise had saved and never forgot it, Eli the stable hand, who had grown into a horse breeder of some renown in the county, those people told it differently. They told it as a love story, because that was what it was primarily before it was anything else. James Townsend grew up to be a rancher and a decent man with his father's steadiness and his mother's capacity to observe clearly and act on what he saw. He married a woman from Wellington named Ruth in 1901, and they had 3 children and managed a portion of the Double T land with the care of someone who had been taught what land meant by people who understood it. Clara Townsend grew up to be a physician. It took some years and considerable fighting, because women in medicine in Kansas in the 1890s faced a particular and sustained set of obstacles, but her mother had faced obstacles and her father had backed her mother in facing them. And Clara had inherited the stubbornness of both parents in her own particular combination, and she qualified and practiced and was fierce and skilled, and she lived in Caldwell, and she never let anyone call her anything but Dr. Townsend. And nobody who tried the alternative did it twice. Louise kept working in her medical room until 1901, when she was 48, and then she scaled back to training and advising rather than primary practice, because her eyes were beginning to be unreliable at fine work, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge when an adjustment was necessary. She handed the practice to Clara with the formality of someone transferring something important, and Clara received it with the formality of someone who understood exactly what she was being given. Samuel ranched until his body told him clearly that it was time for James to take the primary work. He did not stop working entirely, because he was not the kind of man who could stop entirely, but he accepted the shift gracefully, which was characteristic of him. They grew old on the double T together, these two people who had collided on a Kansas main street in 1879 and chosen each other with the kind of clarity that doesn't come often and ought to be honored when it does. The porch was still their place. The chairs were very worn now, shaped entirely to them. The evenings were still long in summer and deep in winter, and always, that vast sky. There was a spring evening in 1905, Samuel 56, Louise 52, the children grown and in their own lives and the grandchildren beginning, James's first son Daniel already 3 years old, and already showing signs of the same directed attention that ran through the family like a particular thread. When Louise looked at Samuel on the porch in the long gold light, and thought of all the springs and all the evenings and all the years between this one and the first one. He caught her looking and looked back. "What?" he said. "I was thinking," she said, "that you are remarkably still the same person you were when I met you." He considered this. "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said. "It's the opposite of a complaint." He looked at her with that face, that open face that had never learned to be anything other than exactly what it was, and she saw in it everything she had always seen and some additional things that age had added, that same steadiness and seriousness and warmth, deepened by 26 years of a life shared in every real sense. "You are also," he said, "remarkably still the same person you were when I met you." "Is that a complaint?" she asked, with the ghost of a smile. "It is absolutely not," he said. She reached across and took his hand, as she had done on the second evening and on every significant evening between then and this one, and he held it the same way he always had, firmly and warmly, and with the complete attention he gave to everything that mattered. The Kansas sky stretched out above the double T in every direction, enormous and deepening toward evening, the first stars appearing in the east. The mockingbird that had lived in the elm at the edge of the yard for as long as either of them could remember, or the descendants of that mockingbird, which came to the same thing, began its evening song. The grass moved in the long wind. They sat together on the porch of the house they had built into a life, in the world they had made, in the particular and irreplaceable companionship of two people who had recognized each other on a dusty Kansas street in the spring of 1879 and had never stopped being glad of it. There was nothing left unresolved, nothing left unsaid that needed saying. Everything that had been broken had been mended, and everything that had been uncertain had been settled, and everything that had been feared had been faced, and the outcome was this: the porch and the chairs and the evening and the sky and the two of them holding on. The mockingbird sang. The stars came out. The double T stood solid in the Kansas dark as it had for 26 years and would stand for 26 more. And Louise Townsend, who had ridden into Caldwell in the spring of 1879 with a leather satchel and her father's books, and the conviction that she was going to be all right if she kept her head and trusted her instincts, leaned against her husband's shoulder and listened to the mockingbird sing, and she was entirely right.